So here's another tutorial. This one is not going to be a Unity tutorial as I have been doing. This is actually going to be a transition tutorial. And what I mean by that is a transition between Max and Maya. So I'm kind of assuming you're somewhat familiar with Maya, and it's going to teach you how to do what you do in Max, or sorry, in Maya in Max. So for this video I'm going to go on to the very basics, just controlling the viewport and creating objects and working with them. Again, you're probably going to need to work with both Max and Maya, so it's good to know the differences between them. So for starters, when you actually look around the viewport, it's not like in Maya, where in Maya you have Alt and then the combination of your 3 mouse clicks. In Max you use Control and Alt and only the middle button. So for example, if you hold Alt and middle button, you can orbit around the center of your screen or the object you have selected. Now here's one thing you have to do, which is not set by default. Is you go down here to the bottom corner and you'll see it says it's a little orb with some arrows coming out of it. That's the orbit button. Click and hold, and then the menu comes up. Select this middle one here, the second one from the top, and that one means it's going to orbit around the object you have selected. Then you also have Control and middle button, and that's your scroll. Whoops. And then you have Control plus Alt at the same time, and your middle button, that gives you scroll. Another way to do that is just by scrolling your mouse wheel, and it does the same thing. Then we have the viewports here. Now, getting around is a little bit different. You don't use spacebar to get around. Instead, what you do is you select the viewport you want to change to. But like, say this is the top. I press Alt W, and that's the hotkey to switch to whatever you have selected. In addition to that, each viewport has its own hotkey. So, for example, I'm in perspective right now. But if I want to go to top, I hit T for top. I can hit F for front, or L for left, and then back to P for perspective. Now, another thing that is a little bit different, and I don't actually know if this is in Maya, I haven't found it yet, but there's a different view. So if you're like in left, for example, and then you scroll, it takes you into this weird orthographic view, which is not quite perspective view. Here you can see, look at the lines, how there's no real perspective per se. If you hit perspective, you'll see that's actual perspective. Orthographic perspective. So I'm not 100% sure on the uses of it, but you'll see that it's actually quite useful to have when you're like in the bottom, you switch and you just want to get around the object a little bit. But again, I don't know if that's in Maya, but it's just one thing I noticed about Max. So another thing is the difference in, actually before I get that, let me just make a box here, and I'll go over this in a second. I just want to make a point. So you can actually change the way you view your models here. So you have smooth and highlights. This one will show you some sort of quasi pseudo lighting here, and the edge faces, so it actually shows you the edges on your polygon or your mesh. Hidden line is basically gives you the lines, but there's no lighting information on here at all. Wireframe is just the outlines, so just your edges, and then you have flat. And then flat is again a color but no lighting. If you add the edge faces, which is on right now, you can turn it off. Then it's just 100%. It just looks like a drawn shape. There's no 3D lighting to it. And then edge faces just let you see the edges. I usually work in either this one or smooth highlights. Smooth highlights is probably my favorite. Okay, so back to how I created this box. Let me delete it there. So in Max, your menus are a little bit different. They're not positioned up here like they would be on Maya. In Max, you have all your tools right here. Now, by default, it's actually going to look like this. And then you have your Create tab here. There's different tabs. Create tab has all your create options. You can make geometry, shapes, etc., etc. And you have the different kinds of shapes you can create within here. There's actually some built in that are a little bit different, but standard primitives are just your basic objects like you would have in Maya. In this case, you want to make a box. So for box, you just click it. I hold Control and then drag, because that keeps it uniform, so it keeps all the sides the same length. And then you drag it up, and then click, and there's your box. Now, one thing to note that is different is that it's not automatically a polygon. This is a standard primitive. If you want to edit this, you can go to the Modify tab, and here you see your box selected. Whatever you have selected is what you're modifying. Again, here's all the same things. You can add segments to it. But one thing you can't do is you can't edit the edges, vertices, faces, nothing. So what you have to do is right click it and then convert it into an editable poly. And here's nodes, by the way, something you may be familiar with. But we're going to create it to convert to poly. So an editable poly lets you edit all these things. So you expand this menu here, and then you have access, for example, to the vertices. So I select vertex, and now I can modify just these vertices, the edges, or the border. The border, you can actually only see if there's this space missing, for example. I'll select the edges all around the empty space. And polygon is just Max's word for faces. So instead of face, it just says polygon, but it's the same thing. And an element would be if you attach multiple meshes together, then you could select individual elements individually. That's kind of redundant. Okay, so another thing I want to go over real quickly is a few of the major differences in how you edit this model. So for starters, the polygons. So let's say I want to extrude this edge right here, or this face right here. You can expand this, by the way. It shows all your options. So here's the edit polygons subsection, which is the part you're probably going to use the most. You can click the settings right next to extrude, and you see it automatically extrudes a little bit. This is just because I was playing with it earlier. But here you can just click and drag and select the length or the height. Click OK, and that's your extrusion right there. Another thing is that instead of doing insert edge loop, what you do is you connect these edges together. So let's say I want to connect these four. I select all the way around, and I want to make a connection all the way across. So I'm going to use the connect tool, press the settings, and here I see that I get my same dialog box. Let's say I want two connections. Pinch is just how close or how spaced out they are. And then the slide is if I want to move it up and down or to the left or to the right, depending on how it's oriented. So in this case, I'm going to set it to 0, hit OK, and now I have these connections here. So again, that's kind of like your insert edge loop. But you have to do it, you go about it a little different way. And this is actually one of my favorite tools in here, along with the cut tool. Lastly, for this video, I just want to go over bridging. So let's say I have this polygon here, and I delete it. So now I want to bridge this face here, which is empty. So I grab the borders. So this border, or sorry, the edges, this edge, and this edge. So I want to bridge those together. So I just hit bridge, and there's the face. One thing that you won't get, like you do with Maya, is the multiple vertices. When you bridge it together, even though you're only selecting these two edges and not these, it still will merge your vertices for you, which is kind of nice. And on that topic, the last thing I'm going to show you is actually merging vertices manually. So what you do is you collapse the vertices. So this is down here under Edit Geometry. You have Edit Vertices because you're in Vertex, but here we want to edit the geometry. So what we do is we move it a little bit closer, and you control click the other vertex that you want to collapse, and then you go to collapse, and then these are now one. So when you select it, see they move together. So it's just one now. Now obviously this is a bad shape because we got some weird geometry here, but that's just to make the point. But anyway, in later videos I'll go over some more advanced modeling techniques that you may be familiar with from Maya.